Summer is coming to an end, which I am grateful for because the heat has made life unbearable. I read a bunch of books and comics and manga during the last 3 months, so here's my thoughts on them. The first book I read is The Shadow of the Gods, a Nordic-inspired dark fantasy book that I read for a genre book club I do with my brother. It follows 3 separate characters in a world where gods once existed, but after a war between them all that is left is their artifacts and bloodlines. Their demigod ancestors are now hunted down just for the crime of being born. This book was a lot of fun, although I can't really say it was great. One of the highlights of the book, and the thing I've heard this series is known for, is the action. John Gwynne is really good at making you understand every moment of the action, and he has a talent for making you understand where everyone is in the battle. There are some really fantastic action sequences in here, but I do have to say that a lot of the action lacks proper stakes, and often motivation. Sometimes it just feels like action for action's sake, which is still fun, but doesn't feel very tense. I like the world a lot, but I can't say I found it too memorable. It being inspired by Norse mythology and culture is really cool. I like how the thinking of that world and times are entrenched into the minds of the characters, although sometimes they do feel like they break out of it. The 3 main characters are all fun, but some of their stories are a little too similar, and they all have their moments of being a little boring. I also think Gwynne has a tendency here to keep information about these characters from us, so he can reveal it in a later part in the book, which is fun when it works, but it didn't work most of the time for me. Most of the time, the information that is kept from us would have made what came before more interesting and more tense, and by keeping it a secret, it just makes those earlier parts weaker. That to me is the biggest flaw of this book. So much of what is going on is saved as a surprise for the last quarter. I think this mystery is supposed to create tension, and then the reveal or release. Most of the time, I didn't even know there was a mystery, so it's revealed did nothing for me. The final battle of this book has several of these moments, and left me confused and mostly bored. I am being pretty negative, but overall, I did still enjoy this book. John Gwynne's prose is really solid, and it is consistently entertaining. I think this book honestly works at its best when it is slower in the beginning, because while the plotting is entertaining, I started losing my emotional attachment to the characters along the way. I'll give it 3 stars. The next book I read was White Trash, The 400-Year Untold History of Class in America. This is a history book looking at the public perception and history of the poor in America, specifically poor whites. I thought this book was really solid, maybe honestly a little short for me. There were sections I wish were expanded upon. It's an easy read, although I generally prefer my nonfiction a little drier and philosophical. I think class is barely talked about in America. There is a general notion among most people that we don't have strict class divides, but I think that class is sort of integral to how we view and talk about each other. I think this book is really good at broaching that subject. I'll give it 4 stars. Great book. The next book I read was Catching Fire, the sequel to The Hunger Games. I really liked The Hunger Games on a reread, and I liked Catching Fire even more than the first. I thought this book was fantastic. For being the YA dystopian series that inspired so many others that aren't very good, Collins feels like she has a genuine grasp on authoritarianism, and I think that's because she heavily based it on the current United States, instead of an imaginary future evil. I believe she said in an interview that she got the idea for The Hunger Games when she was channel flipping between reality television and news about the Iraq War. I think Collins avoids a lot of the pitfalls of young adult novels by making Katniss feel really powerless within the story. This book is really about Katniss deciding to fight against the Capitol, and then having the rug pulled out from under her when she is forced back into the games, and then having that rug pulled out from under her once more in the end. She makes decisions within the story, but the direction of her life is completely out of her control. Katniss really feels like a teenager here, and that she's kind of realizing how the world works, and deciding how to live in it, but also dealing with what she can't control. She's not a hero, she's just a girl who is thrust into these circumstances. Great book. Genuinely recommend for even adults. 5 stars. The next book I read is a philosophy book by Michel Foucault, called Discipline and Punishment. This book isn't really philosophy. It's more a history book with a philosophical approach to the subject. I really loved the way Foucault approached history. He views events like the rise of prisons, hospitals, and schools through the lens of systems of thought that rose from specific circumstances. He calls these epistemes, which are the guiding unconsciousness of subjectivity within a given time period. His discussions of the medieval way of executions and torture was really eye-opening, in that he is able to put that awful stuff in context of the purpose it served to society, and how not too dissimilar it is to how we do punishment today. It kind of broke the notion for me that we are this super advanced society that is broken from these systems, and it really made me interrogate the systems of belief I unconsciously vehemently believe in. The primary modes of thinking, science primarily, really shapes our unconscious beliefs. And it's not that we can ever truly break away from them, but we can challenge and seek to change them. At least, that's what I believe. I think what Foucault does with Discipline and Punish is interrogate these systems of thought that are never spoken about, because they are so integrated into how we function as societies. I really want to read his book on sexuality now. 5 stars, obviously. Highly recommend this book. The next book I read was Mockingjay, the final book in the Hunger Games trilogy. This book is where I really think the series is at its best. I remember when I was younger, I found it less interesting because there were no Hunger Games in it. But I think, and as Katniss states, the games can never really stop until the Capitol is overthrown. I absolutely adore the way District 13, which are the revolutionary forces, are presented here. They are not this morally righteous group that never does anything wrong. They are a military force that feels like it has grown in reaction to the Capitol. They are presented as, at times, being even more controlling of people's day-to-day than the Capitol was. And, if you've read the book, committing pretty awful acts in the name of ending the war. But don't be mistaken, this book does not make some kind of both sides argument, or a call for nonviolence. Collins presents the revolutionaries as necessary, and ultimately, their war essential for moving on from the old system. For a young adult book, this feels incredibly mature and realistic, which is not really what I expected on a reread. Collins' writing throughout the whole series is really great. She's able to convey so much in so little words. She rarely describes what things even look like, and I'm still able to completely envision them in my head. Her characterization of each character, and especially Katniss, are all great, and the emotion she's able to convey from her perspective is incredibly moving. The one thing I remembered from this book from when I was young was the ending, which was so sad and shocking that it stuck with me for years. And the ending is, I won't spoil any specific events, really not a happy ending. It is an ending that lacks closure and emotional resolution because these characters can never fully get past what they have gone through. I found it equally as harrowing as I did when I read it in middle school. I loved this book and was kind of shocked at how great this whole series was on a reread. 5 stars. The next book I read is Crave, which I didn't actually finish. Crave is a vampire romance novel taking place in a gothic school for magical beings like witches, dragons, and vampires. I really wanted to finish this book, but just couldn't. It reminds me a lot of fan fiction, in that it drags out everything so you experience every second of the main character's day. And it's also kind of stupid. Sometimes fun stupid, which is why I wanted to finish it, but most of the time it's just boring stupid. Crave is about a girl who moves to her uncle's boarding school in Alaska and meets a boy named Jackson Vega, which might be the greatest name ever, who is a dark and mysterious bad boy who she begins to fall in love with. The book is 500 pages long, and it takes around until page 250 for the main character to find out about the magic. And even then, she doesn't learn much. This book really likes to give you morsels of information at a time, which could work if the rest of the time was filled with character work, but most of this book is characters talking or doing stuff that doesn't affect anything or matter at all. The character work here is extremely weak. The main character is a non-character. He has no direct goals or a distinct voice. There are several moments in the book where she laments her love for drawing, playing guitar, and watching Netflix shows, but those facts about her never come up again or say anything about who she is. The side characters are all also nondescript, and the mysterious Jackson Vega feels frequently inconsistent. It's not all bad. There are moments that I liked. There's a scene where the main character, I can't remember her name for the life of me, is texting Jackson Vega, and the author is able to get across the giddy feeling of a teenage girl texting her crush. There are some moments where the book seems to understand how silly it is, and kind of breaks the fourth wall. And although they feel mismatched with the story it's telling, I still found these moments kind of fun. I think the reason Crave does not work is because there is very little attention to character or theme. It feels too loose and wishy-washy with its prose and structure to be interesting, and the dialogue just sucks. I think this could have been the exact same concept and silly tone and been fun, but it's just very poorly written. Bad book, but I won't rate because I DNF'd. I'm much more of an avid reader of manga and comic books than I am with books, and I hope you'll stick around as I talk about them. The first manga I read was Perfect World, which is about a woman who falls in love with a man in a wheelchair and then has to deal with the difficulties of being in a relationship with a disabled person. I found this one incredibly moving and really educational. The writer herself is not in a wheelchair, but it feels like she has done her best to research and interview people with disabilities to create an accurate portrayal of disability, or at least an accurate portrayal within a melodrama josei manga. I'm sure it's not perfect. This worked well for me because it balances the melodrama aspect with the more informational aspects, and the characters are given enough respect to be flawed, complex characters. I usually find a lot of these sorts of manga to be too melodramatic or unrealistic, and while Perfect World isn't necessarily realistic, its emotions come from a real place, so their heightening through melodrama feels natural for the story. Really great manga. It's pretty long at 12 volumes, and my library had it, so shout out libraries. 4 stars. The manga that took up so much of my time this summer, the one that I was obsessed with, the one that I stayed up till 1 a.m. reading, was Naruto. I watched the first few episodes of Naruto a few years ago, but never went beyond that. But I can now say I understand why this series is so beloved. Naruto is awesome. Spanning over 700 chapters in 70 volumes, Naruto is a massive story that grows and grows with every volume, but never feels repetitive or abandons its core characters and themes. The world building to me is Naruto's strongest element, especially in how it determines all of the character arcs and the themes of the series. The characters of Naruto inhabit a world of conflict and war that was built over an old system that was even more violent and warlike. The villages and nations of Naruto are all flawed and at times evil organizations, but they are just what was built to try and maintain order for everyday people. Ninjas are soldiers who sometimes have to do horrible things, and sometimes those horrible things give rise to even worse things. History weighs down on all of Naruto, and the characters have to contend with history and how it has shaped the present. I guess you could say they must face their time's epistemes. Naruto is a great main character. He is still like every shonen protagonist in that he's bold, a little dim-witted, and has very strong beliefs, but it is when his beliefs are challenged when Naruto must contend with the systems of belief he was raised on, and decide whether to concede to darkness or to fight for a better future. Naruto does not fight to forget the past. He fights because of the past, and that past is why he fights for a better future. And it is a little corny, but I find it incredibly moving. This manga is incredible, but I also must admit that it is also deeply flawed. There are so many fighting systems that appear and then suddenly disappear. There's a lot of bad humor, and there's several weak side characters who get forgotten. But these elements only make it more charming to me in a way. I love flawed art, but it does have one big glaring fault that I cannot get past, and it's that it is glaringly sexist. Every single female character in this series has one single personality trait. They are obsessed with a man and want his attention. Without fail, that is how each female character acts. Some of them have other minor personality traits, but it is glaringly obvious with Sakura, who is severely underwritten and underutilized in the story because the crux of her character is that she likes a boy. Despite that big fault, I think Naruto is still one of my favorite manga I have ever read. It is way more thematically dense than I expected it to be. 5 stars. The first comic I read in the summer was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: The Last Ronin, which is a story where 3 of the 4 Ninja Turtles die, leaving Michelangelo alone to defeat the authoritarian regime Shredder has built. This is an apocalyptic take on a comic, which is a bit of a trend in comics, and one I'm not particularly fond of. I haven't read the Ninja Turtles comics, so I don't know a lot about the side characters. I would probably think differently about this if I had. The authoritarian regime Michelangelo is fighting against, and the rebels he joins, feels so disconnected from reality that it was hard for me to feel like the work had anything valuable to say. Which, maybe it wasn't trying to, but the character stuff didn't work for me either, so overall I found this sort of pointless. The artwork is pretty nice, but not so nice that it stuck with me. It only gets 2 stars. The next comic I read was The Question: All Along the Watchtower, which is a recent DC comic. It follows Renee Montoya, a detective who works in Gotham, who takes up the mantle of The Question at the behest of Superman, to investigate the Justice League Watchtower. When she is there, a superhero is murdered, and the key culprit is her ex-girlfriend, Batwoman. This is a bit of a spin-off of the recent Justice League Unlimited comics, which I've been really enjoying, but I did not really enjoy this one. I didn't find Renee all that intriguing of a character, and I cannot remember anything of the mystery she solves. I found this one pretty forgettable. 2 stars. A lot of the comics I've been reading were rented from my local library. Seriously, check out your library for comics. These next three are a series of shorter Batman comics I rented from there. The first one is Batman the Imposter, which take place in the early days of Batman's career when an imposter Batman begins killing people. I enjoyed this one, although it does feel like it doesn't have that much new to add to the character or story. I find this with a lot of Batman stories. They want to tell a story without changing Batman. They're just about him reinforcing his own beliefs. And it works decently when the story is compelling, but it's also a little boring. I like this, but I didn't love it. 3 stars. The next Batman comic I read was Batman The Last Night on Earth. This is a post-apocalyptic take on the DC universe, and like The Last Ronin, I usually do not enjoy these kinds of stories. But I did enjoy this one. Batman Last Night on Earth presents itself first as one of those stories. It's aching with nihilism, it's edgy, it's brutal, and often really cruel. But by the end, it's able to come together as something moving and strangely optimistic. I'm going to spoil most of it, so if you don't want spoilers, skip to this time. Batman wakes up to a world that has ended, and the ending of this world was Batman's fault. Lex Luthor had planted emotional kyber crystals all around the globe that would extenuate people's emotions. He then debated Superman about humanity on worldwide television. If people decided to go with Superman, the crystals would extenuate their feelings of cooperation and goodness. If they sided with Lex Luthor, their anger and fear at the world. They chose Lex Luthor, and stormed the Justice League building, where Batman opened the door to talk to them, and the Justice League was killed, which led to the end of the world. Even knowing that, even knowing every person on Earth turned on them, even knowing that people are cruel and selfish, Batman and the remaining heroes, in spite of all the horrors, decide to continue fighting for people, because they believe that a better future is still possible. This is not a perfect story. It's very edgy and quite silly, but I like that it presents a world that is so cruel and awful, but still decides to find hope in it. 4 stars. I recommend it. The final Batman comic I read was Batman One Dark Knight, which is a pretty short one about an energy-absorbing supervillain who gets loose in Gotham and shuts the city's power down. This one tries its best to feel realistic to a point, but after the power goes out, the immediate descent into chaos and gang violence felt way too absurd. Overall, I thought this one was alright. It was well paced, the story is contained to a single night, which allowed for the whole thing to feel more cohesive. The artwork is quite beautiful too. I love the way the dark city looks. It's sort of like Batman the Imposter in that it's not anything new for the character, but I had fun. 3 stars. The next comic I read was Spider-Boy. I keep up with a lot of Marvel comics, and one of these stand out worse for me in recent years was the introduction of Spider-Boy into the Spider-Man comics. The story where he was introduced in was a Spider-Verse story, which I already dislike, and I found him annoying and pointless when he was introduced. So when he got his own run, I assumed I would hate it, but I actually thought this one was kind of cute. Spider-Boy is definitely targeted at a younger audience, which allows its lower stakes stories to work. Spider-Boy evolves into a fun character who can stand on his own. He's not just a Spider-Man ripoff, and the comic builds up a fun cast of side characters. I don't know if I would really recommend this one, because it is a kid's comic, but 3 stars. I enjoyed it. The next comic I read was Helen of Windhorn, which is a fantasy story about a girl returning to her father's mansion after her father's death, and then begins adventuring into a fantasy land with him. Despite how uniquely presented this story is, and how beautiful the artwork is, I found that this entire comic just washed over me, and didn't leave much of an impact. One problem I have with a lot of comics is that they use too many words to describe what could be said in very little, therefore filling the page with waste, or could just be shown to us through the images. Despite how much words are given to the main character of the story, I never felt any emotional connection to what was happening. A very pretty comic, maybe one you would find value in, but I didn't really. 3 stars. The next comic I read was Doll Parts, which I did not realize was a prequel series to a comic called Lovesick until I had finished it. This is a gruesome and disturbing horror comic about a girl who becomes obsessed with gore videos. There are a lot of thematic elements of female sexualization and repression, and our views of violence against women, presented in very visceral and horrible imagery. This comic is not for the faint of heart. It is truly disturbing, but I think it has some interesting things to say, at least in the first half. Once the main character reaches a certain point, it feels like the story is just reveling in its own cruelty and violence, or is just trying to set up for the next series. I have mixed thoughts on this one. I think its attempts at transgression are interesting, but not nearly as transgressive as they'd hoped to be. And I think the comic begins to lose its thematic weight in the second half, which makes the violence and cruelty feel pointless. I would recommend this one, but I would recommend it with a massive, massive trigger warning. Do not read this if anything remotely awful disturbs you. 3 stars. And that is what I read in the summer. I don't know if I will do one of these again. My first few videos on this channel are just going to be stuff that interests me, so no real theme. I thought about making one channel for book stuff and one for film stuff, but decided against it. If you like this video and want more, leave a comment. My next video I'm planning is over the anime in the fall season, so subscribe if that sounds cool to you.